She was traded away like a debt no one wanted to pay. Elora, the outcast girl with the scar that glowed faintly over her heart, was never told the truth that her own pack elders had signed her life over to the Shadowblade pack to save themselves from war. She thought she was worthless. She thought no one would ever come looking for her. She was wrong. 300 miles north, in a fortress carved from black stone, in older grief, King Caelen, the eternal Alpha King, cursed to burn through centuries, searching for a soul that kept slipping through his fingers. He felt a mark on his chest ignite like a struck match. He had waited lifetimes for that light. He did not know her name yet, but his wolf already did, and it was done waiting. The morning Elora was given away, the sky over Sunridge Pack was the color of a healing bruise, soft violet bleeding into a sick yellow at the horizon, as if even the heavens knew something ugly was about to happen and didn't have the courage to stop it. She stood at the edge of the training yard with her arms wrapped around herself, watching her breath fog in the cold, and she told herself the way she always told herself that the knot in her stomach was nothing, just hunger. Just the ache of another sleepless night spent listening to the other girls in the pack house whisper about her through the thin walls. Cursed girl, marked girl, the one the moon forgot to bless. She had heard it so many times it had stopped landing like an insult and started landing like a fact, dull and heavy, something she carried the way she carried water buckets up from the well, necessary, unpleasant, hers. The scar over her heart burned faintly that morning. It always did when something was about to change, though she'd never understood that about herself, not in 18 years of trying. It was shaped like a crescent wrapped around a small, jagged star, silver white against her brown skin, and on quiet nights when the pack house was finally still, she would press her palm against it and feel warmth pulse beneath her fingers, like a second secret heartbeat. No one else in Sunridge had a mark like it. No one else had ever wanted to explain what it meant. When she was 7 and had asked Elder Marrow about it, he'd gone pale and told her to keep it covered and never speak of it again. And something in his face had frightened her enough that she'd obeyed for 11 years straight. She didn't know that the scar was not a curse at all. She didn't know it was a royal claiming mark, dormant and waiting, twin to one carved into the chest of a king who had been hunting for her soul across 400 years of reincarnated lifetimes. She only knew that Elder Marrow was crossing the yard toward her now, with 2 other elders flanking him, and that the look on his face was the same look the butcher wore right before the knife came down. Elora. Marrow's voice was clipped, formal, wrong. He never used her full name unless he was about to say something he didn't want to be blamed for later. Come with us. There is a matter to discuss. She should have run. Some buried ancient part of her, the part that lived beneath the scar, beneath 18 years of being told she was less, screamed at her to run. She didn't listen. She never had reason to trust her own instincts. Sunridge had spent her whole life teaching her that her instincts, like everything else about her, were wrong. She remembered, with the strange clarity fear sometimes brings, a morning 9 years ago when she'd tried to run then too. 6 years old and stubborn, hiding in the grain store after the other children had thrown mud at her scar and called her demon-touched, certain that if she'd just stayed hidden long enough, someone would come looking, someone would ask where she'd gone. No one had. Elder Marrow himself had found her 3 hours later, not out of worry, but because the grain store needed sweeping, and he'd looked at her tear-streaked, mud-flecked face with the same flat, administrative disinterest he wore now, and told her that hiding solved nothing, that a wolf who couldn't face what she was would never survive long in this world. She had believed him. She had spent every year since trying to prove she could face anything at all, and it had earned her nothing. No kindness, no belonging, only this, a hall full of strangers and an alpha who wouldn't meet her eyes. They walked her to the Alpha's hall, a long timber building strung with old firs and older banners, and she noticed, too late to matter, that there were strangers waiting inside. Men in black leather marked with a wolf's skull sigil she didn't recognize, standing utterly still, utterly silent, the way predators stand when they've already decided the outcome of a hunt. "Sit," Marrow said, and she sat, because sitting was easier than the alternative of finding out what happened when she refused. Alpha Draven of Sunridge did not look at her when he spoke. That, more than anything, told her everything. "The border dispute with the Shadowblade territory has been resolved," he said, addressing the room instead of her, as though she were a piece of furniture being discussed for sale, which, she would understand within the hour, was exactly what she was. "A treaty has been struck, land rights, hunting grounds, peace along the ridge for the next generation." "That's good?" Elora offered, because someone seemed to want her to say something, and the silence was worse than speaking into it. "She's marked," Marrow added quickly, too quickly, and Elora caught something flicker across his face. Not cruelty exactly, but a fear so old it had calcified into something that looked like cruelty from the outside. The scar. It has value. Shadowblade collects such things. Omens. Curiosities. Curiosities. The word landed like a slap. They didn't ask her if she was willing. They didn't ask her anything at all. Within the hour, her few belongings, a wool blanket, a cracked wooden comb, a single dried flower pressed between the pages of a book she couldn't remember owning but had loved anyway, were bundled into a canvas sack and shoved into her arms, and she was walked, flanked on both sides like a prisoner, to a wagon waiting at the edge of the territory line. No one said goodbye. No one apologized. The pack she had lived in her entire life, the only home she had ever known, closed its gates behind her without a single backward glance, and Elora sat in the back of a cold wagon, rattling north toward a place she'd only ever heard called, in hushed and frightened tones, the Forgotten Pack. Shadowblade, the pack that lived at the edge of the world where the sun forgot to reach and the moon forgot to bless, where wolves were said to be harsher and colder and less like people than anywhere else on the continent. She pressed her palm flat against her chest, against the scar burning faint and warm beneath her fingers, the only warmth left to her, and she did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying changed nothing. It only used up water she couldn't spare. The journey took 3 days, and each one felt colder than the last, the land itself seeming to shed its warmth mile by mile, as if apologizing in advance for where she was headed. On the second night, the driver, an older Shadowblade escort named Petra, who spoke rarely and looked at Elora with something that might, in a kinder world, have been pity, made camp beneath a stand of skeletal birch trees and handed her a heel of hard bread without a word. Elora ate it slowly, savoring even that small, silent kindness, and watched the stars wheel overhead through branches like bone, and told herself that whatever waited at the end of this road could not possibly be lonelier than what she was leaving behind. She did not yet know how wrong that hope would prove to be, nor how right it would eventually become. By the third morning, the birches had given way entirely to black pine, and the air had turned thin and sharp enough to sting her lungs, and somewhere deep beneath the ache of exhaustion and grief, the scar on her chest pulsed once, warm and strange, as though it recognized the direction they were traveling, even if she did not. She did not know, as the wagon carried her north into the dark, that somewhere far beyond the mountains, a king had awoken from a 400-year sleep of restless dreams with his hand pressed to his own chest, gasping, certain, for the first time in centuries, that he had felt her heartbeat. Shadowblade territory announced itself before she ever saw it. The trees changed first. The golden birch and warm oak of Sunridge giving way to black pine, tall and close and silent, their needles so dark they looked almost like char. The air changed next, growing thin and sharp, carrying the mineral bite of stone and old snow, even though it was only autumn. And then, finally, the fortress itself rose out of the fog like something the mountain had grown rather than something built. Black stone walls, unadorned, functional, without a single banner or carving to soften their brutal whines. The wagon rolled through gates that groaned like something in pain, and Elora climbed down on legs stiff from 3 days of travel into a courtyard full of watching eyes. No one smiled, no one waved. A dozen or so pack members, broad-shouldered warriors, hard-faced women hauling firewood, a cluster of children who stared at her with the blank, assessing look of animals sizing up a stranger, simply watched as she was walked toward the central hall, and Elora understood with the particular clarity of someone who has spent her whole life being unwanted that she was not welcome here either. The woman who received her at the hall doors introduced herself only as Rennick, first enforcer, and she looked Elora over the way a butcher looks over livestock, appraising, indifferent, already calculating cost against yield. "So, you're the treaty gift, the marked one." "Elora," she said quietly. "My name is Elora." Rennick's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Names are for pack. You're not pack. You're a Det Sunridge Otis walking around on 2 legs. You'll work in the kitchens and the healing house. You'll keep that scar covered at all times. Alpha Kane's orders, not mine, so don't ask me why. You'll speak when spoken to, and you will not, under any circumstance, use whatever gutter magic put that mark on you where anyone can see. Are we understood?" Elora swallowed hard around the lump in her throat. Understood. She did not ask why the scar mattered so much to 2 separate packs who would never bother to explain it to her. She had learned that questions in places like this only cost her more than she already had. The weeks that followed blurred into a grinding sameness. She woke before dawn to haul water from a well so cold it burned her hands. She scrubbed cookpots in a kitchen where the fire never quite reached the corners, worked until her back screamed and her fingers cracked and bled in the dry mountain air, and she ate what was left after the pack proper had eaten, which was, some nights, nothing at all. The Shadowblade wolves were not cruel in the dramatic storybook way she might have imagined, with beatings and shouted insults. Theirs was a colder cruelty, the cruelty of complete indifference, as though she were furniture that occasionally needed to be fed, present in every room and acknowledged in none. She ate alone, she slept alone, in a narrow storage room off the kitchens, curled beneath the one wool blanket she'd carried from home, and some nights the loneliness pressed down on her chest so hard she had to bite her own knuckles to keep from making a sound. There was one night, perhaps 2 weeks in, when the loneliness became something close to unbearable. She had scrubbed the kitchen floor until her hands bled at the knuckles, had eaten a cold, thin broth alone in the dark long after everyone else had gone to bed, and had lain awake on her narrow cot, listening to the wind claw at the shutters, and thinking with a clarity that frightened her that no one on this entire continent would notice if she simply stopped existing. She had pressed her palm to the scar on her chest that night, the way she always did when the ache grew too large to hold alone, and for the first time in her memory, the warmth beneath her fingers had felt less like a private, secret comfort and more like something reaching back, faint, distant, patient, as though whatever lived on the other end of that warmth was waiting for her the way she had once, foolishly, hoped someone at Sunridge might wait for her. She hadn't understood it. She had simply held on to it, the way a drowning person holds on to driftwood, and let it carry her into sleep. But she noticed things too, small things, the way old Bram the stable master favored his left leg after a training accident and no healer had properly set the bone, the way little Fen, only 9 years old, walked with a hitch in her step from a fall off the north wall that had left a hairline fracture nobody had time to tend. The pack had a healer, an old man named Torvald, but his hands shook too badly now to do the delicate work healing required, and there was no one to replace him. And Elora had magic. Dormant, quiet, buried beneath years of being told to hide it, but it was there, humming beneath her scar like a second pulse, and she had never once in her life used it fully, not since the day Elder Myro told her 7-year-old self to bury it and never speak of it again. The first time she used it, it was an accident. She was cleaning the healing house one gray afternoon, alone except for Bram, who lay on a cot with his bad leg propped and his face gray with old, unaddressed pain. And she was so tired of watching good people suffer for want of care that before she'd consciously decided to do anything at all, her hand was resting over his leg and warmth was pouring out of her palm like sunlight through a cracked window. Golden light, faint and soft, wrapped around the break. Bram gasped. Elora froze, panic flooding cold through her chest. She'd been told never, never. But the light didn't stop, didn't listen to her fear, and beneath her palm she felt the bone knit, felt 3 months of pain simply dissolve. Bram stared at her like she'd performed a miracle. In a way, she had. "Don't tell anyone," she begged him, breathless, already regretting it, already terrified of Rennick's warning ringing in her ears. "Please, please don't tell anyone." Bram, gruff, weathered, a man who had shown her no particular kindness in the week she'd been there, looked at his leg, flexed it, found no pain at all, and said only, "Wasn't nothing wrong with your leg to begin with, girl, understand?" It became her secret rebellion, quiet, careful, always after dark, always sworn to silence. She healed Fenn's hairline fracture in a storage closet by lamplight. She eased a deep chest cough of an old warrior named Orwell, who'd been coughing blood for 2 winters running. She mended a hunter's torn shoulder so cleanly he wept, silent and startled, and pressed her hand between both of his and thanked her in a whisper before letting her go without a word to anyone. Slowly, without her noticing it happening, something in the forgotten pack began to shift. The wolves who avoided her began in small ways to soften. A bowl of stew left outside her door on the coldest nights, a worn blanket thicker than her own left folded on her cot with no explanation. No one spoke of it, no one had to. She was still an outcast, still treated with the particular wariness reserved for a stranger and a treaty debt both, but she was no longer entirely invisible, and for a girl who had spent 18 years being unwanted, that small shift felt like the sun breaking through months of gray sky. She did not know that every time she poured her light into a wound, a faint echo of that same golden glow rippled outward, not far, not strong enough yet to be noticed beyond the fortress walls, but present, a signal sent quietly into the world like a stone dropped into still water. She did not know that far to the north, in a throne room carved from obsidian and moonlight, a king had begun to feel those ripples in his sleep, faint as a heartbeat felt through a wall, and had begun, for the first time in 100 years, to hope. King Caelen had not slept a full night in 400 years. He was the eternal Alpha King, a title that sounded, to outsiders, like glory, like power without end, like the kind of blessing men would kill for. It was not. It was a curse dressed in a crown. His soul had been bound at the founding of his bloodline to a single mate soul that reincarnated again and again across the centuries. And every time he found her, every time the 2 halves of that ancient bond finally settled into place, something, war, sickness, a jealous rival, simple bad fortune, tore her away again before the bond could fully seal. And so his wolf, the volatile, ancient spirit that lived beneath his skin and had once nearly burned an entire kingdom to ash in a single night of uncontrolled grief, never truly rested. It waited, it hunted, it grieved in cycles that spanned lifetimes, and it dragged Caelen along with it, awake and restless and half feral with the weight of centuries. He sat now in his war room at the top of the obsidian keep, staring at a map marked with 100 failed searches, villages visited, packs investigated, girls with unusual scars who had, every single time, turned out to be nothing more than girls with unusual scars. His generals had stopped asking him to sleep years ago. They had learned it did no good. "Your Majesty," His first general, a broad, gray-bearded wolf named Torin, who had served 3 of Caelen's near-mate cycles and buried the grief of each one alongside his king, stepped into the war room with unusual urgency in his gait. "You should rest. The council reconvenes at dawn." "I don't rest, Torin," Caelen said without looking up. "You know this." "I know you don't," Torin agreed. "I was suggesting you try." Caelen's laugh had no humor in it. He was a striking man, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with eyes the deep amber of a wolf's even in his human form, a trait unique to royal bloodlines and one that made ordinary wolves look away instinctively, some ancient part of them recognizing an apex predator even through the disguise of civility. He was, by any measure, a powerful, terrifying, magnetic man. He was also, underneath 400 years of practiced composure, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He reached up unconsciously and pressed 2 fingers against the mark on his own chest, a mirror to hers, though he did not know this yet. A crescent wrapped around a jagged star, silver-white and dormant against his skin for longer than he could bear to count. It had been quiet for 6 years. 6 years since the last cycle had ended in tragedy. A girl named Sarah in a village 3 kingdoms south who had died of fever before he'd even finished crossing the border to reach her, the bond snapping shut again just as it had a dozen times before, leaving him hollowed out and his wolf howling in the dark for months. He still remembered the particular quality of that silence, how he had stood outside a small farmhouse with his hand raised to knock, 3 days too late, and heard through the thin wall a mother's grief already spent and hardened into the flat, exhausted grammar of mourning. He had not gone in. There had been nothing left to claim, no bond to complete. Only the wreckage of a life that might have been his had he simply moved faster, searched harder, trusted the mark on his chest 3 days sooner than he had. He had ridden back to the Obsidian Keep in silence, and Torin, wise enough not to offer empty comfort, had simply ridden beside him the entire way without a single word, and that unspoken companionship was, Caelen sometimes thought, the only thing that had kept his wolf from tearing itself apart entirely in the years since. 6 years of silence, and then, 3 nights ago, something had changed. It had woken him from the shallow half-sleep he allowed himself, a jolt of warmth against his chest, so sudden and so real he had sat bolt upright, hands slapping against his own skin, certain that he'd felt something, a pulse, a flicker. Faint, distant, but unmistakably hers, whoever she was this time, wherever this new cycle of her soul had been born. It had happened twice more since, small flares, faint golden warmth blooming against the mark and then fading, like a candle glimpsed through fog and then lost again. Each time his wolf had surged forward in his chest, with a hunger so sharp it had taken every ounce of his 400 years of discipline not to shift on the spot and simply run, blind and desperate toward whatever direction felt closest. "Something is happening," he said aloud, and Torin, who heard variations of this sentence dozens of times across dozens of false leads, did not sigh, though Caelen could tell he wanted to. "Your Majesty?" "I'm not asking you to believe me," Caelen said, quieter now. "I'm telling you to prepare the trackers. Whatever this is, wherever it's coming from, it's stronger than anything I've felt in 6 years. It's building." Torin studied his king for a long moment, the hollow shadows beneath his amber eyes, the tension coiled in his shoulders like a bowstring pulled tight for centuries, and something in his old friend's face made him set aside his doubt. "Which direction?" Torin asked instead. Caelen's jaw tightened. "South, beyond the ridge territories. I don't know more than that yet." "That's half a continent, Caelen." "Then we start with half a continent," the king said, "and we narrow it down, because I am not," his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for Torin to hear 400 years of grief pressing up beneath the royal composure. "I am not losing her again before I even reach her." Torin bowed his head. "I'll ready the trackers by morning." Alone again, Caelen pressed his palm flat over the mark on his chest, over the place where warmth had flickered 3 times now, like a lighthouse signaling through storm fog, and he closed his eyes and did something he had not allowed himself to do in 6 long years. He hoped. "Whoever you are this time, hold on. I am coming. I have always been coming." The attack came at dusk, the way the worst things always seem to. Elora was in the healing house, grinding dried yarrow into powder for old Torvald, when the horn sounded. 3 sharp blasts that split the evening quiet and sent the whole fortress into sudden, controlled chaos. Warriors who had been eating dinner moments before were sprinting for the walls with swords already drawn. Children were being herded into the central hall, with mothers with fear-tight faces. Somewhere outside, a wolf howled a warning, and it was answered by a dozen more. "Rogues," Torvald said grimly, already reaching for his healing satchel with hands that trembled worse than usual. "Border rogues. They've hit the eastern flank twice this season already." Elora's stomach dropped. She had heard whispers of the rogue packs that haunted the mountain passes. Wolves who had lost their territories, their alphas, their sanity, and now survived by raiding whatever settlements they could reach. Shadowblade's remote location, so far from the warmth and protection of the southern packs, made it an easier target than most. She grabbed her own satchel of herbs and bandages without thinking and followed Torvald toward the sound of the fighting, because whatever else she was in this cack, an outcast, treaty debt, curiosity, she was also, underneath it all, someone who could not stand by while people bled. The corridor outside the healing house was already thick with the copper smell of blood by the time they reached it, and the sound, she would remember the sound longest of all, longer even than the light, was a chaos of snapping jaws and human shouting and the wet, terrible thud of bodies meeting stone. Torches guttered wildly in the wind, throwing long, jerking shadows across walls slick with rain that had begun to fall sometime in the last hour, unnoticed in the panic. A warrior stumbled past her, clutching a gash along his ribs, and she caught him without thinking, pressed a wad of cloth hard against the wound, felt his blood soak warm through her fingers, and did not let herself look away even as her stomach turned. This was not the storybook version of battle. There was no glory in it, only fear and noise, and the desperate animal need to survive one more minute. And Elora understood, watching it unfold around her, exactly how thin the line was between the world continuing on as it always had and the world ending entirely, right here in this narrow stone corridor. The eastern wall was chaos made solid. Rogue wolves, wild-eyed and half-starved, tore through the outer defense in a wave of snapping jaws and desperate fury, and Shadowblade's warriors met them with the brutal efficiency of a pack that had learned to survive in the hardest corner of the continent. Elora pressed herself against the healing house doorway, watching Torvald drag a wounded warrior back from the front line, and it was in the chaos of it, the shouting, the blood, the acrid smell of fear sweat and torn earth, that she saw him. Alpha Cain's younger brother, Rian. No older than 14, he had snuck out to watch the fighting despite every order to stay inside, and now he stood frozen in the open courtyard as a massive rogue wolf, easily twice his size, bore down on him with murder in its yellow eyes. There was no time to think. There was no time to remember Rennick's warnings or Marl's warnings or 18 years of being told to bury what she was and never let it show. Elora ran. She didn't remember crossing the distance. She only remembered throwing herself between the boy and the rogue's snapping jaws, remembered her hands coming up on pure animal instinct, remembered the scar on her chest exploding beneath her tunic as every ounce of magic she had ever suppressed, ever hidden, ever been told to be ashamed of, poured out of her at once. Golden light erupted from her palms in a wave that struck the charging rogue mid-leap and sent it tumbling backward, yelping, its fur singed and its eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear of her. The light didn't stop there. It rippled outward across the courtyard, washing over wounded warriors and knitting torn flesh, over broken bones and closing gashes, a wave of pure, overwhelming healing force that left half the battlefield gasping in stunned, pain-free silence. And then it kept going. It rippled outward past the fortress walls, past the black pine forest, past the mountain passes and the river valleys and the sleeping villages of a dozen packs who would wake the next morning swearing they dreamed of golden light on the horizon. It rolled outward like a struck bell, a signal 300 miles wide and 300 miles north in an obsidian keep at the top of a mountain. A king who had not slept in 400 years sat bolt upright with a scream trapped in his throat as the mark on his chest ignited into full, searing, unmistakable light. There, his wolf did not merely stir, it roared to the surface, 400 years of grief and hunger and hope crashing together into a single thunderous certainty. There, we found her, we found her. Caelen was on his feet before the light had even fully faded from his skin, already calling for his army, already moving with a speed and a purpose he had not felt in 100 years. South, he said, voice raw, hand pressed hard against the burning mark on his chest. Beyond the ridge, Shadowblade territory, now. Back in the Shadowblade courtyard, the golden light faded from Elora's hands, and she stood swaying, hollowed out from the sheer scale of the magic she had unleashed, staring at a battlefield gone suddenly, impossibly quiet. Ryan stared up at her, unharmed, his mouth hanging open. Warriors who had been bleeding moments before flexed newly whole limbs in stunned disbelief. And every single set of eyes in that courtyard, every wolf who had ignored her, dismissed her, treated her like furniture for weeks on end, turned to stare at her with a mixture of awe and, far more dangerously, fear. "What?" Renix said slowly, stepping forward with her hand already on the hilt of her blade. "In the name of the Moon Mother was that?" Elora opened her mouth. No explanation came. There was no explanation that would satisfy the terror rippling through the courtyard. No way to make 18 years of hidden magic sound anything other than exactly as forbidden and dangerous as it had always been called. "She used forbidden magic," someone shouted from the crowd. "Elder magic, old world magic. It's not natural." "She saved Ryan's life," Bram countered, stepping forward despite himself, despite everything he'd promised to keep secret. "She saved half this courtyard's life." "She hid it from us," Renix snapped, and there was real fear beneath her anger now, the particular fear of someone who has just watched the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood. "Alpha Cain will decide her fate," Renix said finally, and two warriors seized Elora's arms, not gently, and hauled her toward the central hall to await judgment, while behind her, Ryan stood staring at the place she'd been, his young face a portrait of confusion and unspoken gratitude he wasn't allowed to voice. She did not know, as they dragged her away, that judgment was already 300 miles closer than anyone in that fortress could imagine, and that it would not come in the form anyone expected. Word travels strangely across wolf territories, not by messenger alone, but through the deep instinctive network of pack bonds and moon sense that ties every wolf, however distantly, to the great pulse of their kind. And so it was that by the time Alpha Cain convened his council to decide Elora's fate, whispers had already begun rippling south from the mountain passes. The king's army is moving. The king's army is moving fast, and it's moving toward Shadowblade. Cain received the news with a particular dread of a small pack leader who has just realized his territory has become, for reasons entirely unclear to him, the center of a continent's attention. "The eternal Alpha King," he said slowly, pacing the length of his hall while Renix stood rigid at the door and Elora knelt, wrists bound, in the center of the room, "does not send his royal army for border disputes. He does not send it for trade negotiations. In 400 years, historical record shows he has moved his personal bard exactly 11 times, and every single one of those times was in pursuit of—" He stopped. He looked at Elora, really looked at her, For the first time since she'd arrived weeks ago as an unremarkable treaty debt he'd barely bothered to notice, and something in his expression shifted from confusion into a dawning, disbelieving horror. Uncover the mark, the one on her chest. Now. Elora, exhausted and terrified and still faintly glowing beneath her skin from the scale of magic she'd unleashed hours before, did not resist as Rennick stepped forward and carefully pulled aside the collar of her tunic. The scar was still lit, faint gold pulsing beneath her collarbone, the crescent in star shape catching the torchlight like something carved from captured moonlight. Caelen went very still. "Moon Mother preserve us," he whispered. "That's not a curse mark. That's not an omen mark. That's a royal claiming brand." "A what?" Rennick's voice had gone thin. "The bloodline legend," Caelen said, and now he was the one pacing faster, agitated, running his hair through his hair. The eternal king's soul was bound at the founding of his line to a single mate whose reincarnated soul stabilizes his wolf spirit. Every cycle he's marked identically to her, and every cycle she carries the mirror scar until the bond seals. He has been searching for centuries. We assumed it was myth. Half the continent assumes it's myth. But if that's a genuine claiming brand... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Outside, distant but growing rapidly closer, came the unmistakable thunder of hundreds of horses and wolves moving as one disciplined force. And above the fortress walls, banners bearing the sigil of a crowned wolf's head began to crest the eastern ridge. "He's here," Rennick breathed. "The king is here?" Panic swept the hall. Caelen, caught in an impossible position, a girl he'd been about to condemn for forbidden magic, possibly being the most important soul on the entire continent, made the only decision his fear-addled mind could produce. "Chain her properly," he ordered, voice cracking with strain. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding, if she's stolen that mark or forged it somehow, better we hand her over as a prisoner facing justice for forbidden magic than as if we knew and did nothing. Rennick, prepare the courtyard. We receive the king formally, and someone find out what in the Moon Mother's name is actually happening before we're all executed for treason we didn't know we were committing." They dragged Elora, chains cold and heavy at her wrists, out into the fortress courtyard just as the gates groaned open to reveal the single most overwhelming sight Elora had ever witnessed in her 18 years of life. An army stretched back along the mountain road as far as she could see, hundreds of warriors in black and silver armor, banners snapping in the wind, the low, constant growl of shifted wolves pacing at the army's flanks like a living tide of muscle and teeth. And at the very front, mounted on a horse as black as the fortress stone itself, sat a man who did not need a crown to look like a king. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, his amber eyes visible even from 100 feet away, blazing with an intensity that made every wolf in the courtyard instinctively lower their gaze, except, strangely, Elora, who found she could not look away if she'd wanted to, some deep and ancient part of her chest aching toward him with the pull she had no name for and no memory of ever feeling before. King Caelen dismounted before his horse had fully stopped moving. He did not look at Alpha Cain, standing pale and stammering at the head of his frightened pack. He did not look at the assembled Shadowblade warriors, tense and ready for a battle they knew they could not win. His eyes found Elora across the width of the courtyard, chained, exhausted, glowing faintly with the last embers of spent magic, and something in his face broke open with an emotion so raw, so overwhelming, that half the courtyard felt it like a physical wave. "Chains," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the entire courtyard with an authority that made the ground itself seem to still. "You put her in chains? Your Majesty, Cain began, stumbling forward, already sinking into a bow so deep his knees nearly touched stone. There was an incident, forbidden magic, we believed. We didn't know if we had understood who she... Caelen was not listening. Caelen was walking, and every step he took across that courtyard felt to Elora like the slow tightening of a bowstring drawn back over 400 years. And when he finally reached her, when he finally stood close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, centuries of it, grief layered over an aching, desperate hope, he did not reach first for the chains at her wrists. He reached with a hand that trembled for the mark glowing faintly at her collarbone and pressed his palm gently over it, and Elora gasped as warmth flooded through her chest, a golden pulse that answered the light already living beneath her skin. And for the first time in her entire life, the scar she had been taught to hide and fear did not feel like a curse at all. It felt like coming home. The entire courtyard held its breath. King Caelen, the eternal Alpha King, sovereign of half a continent, a man whose army could level Shadowblade's fortress in an afternoon without breaking formation, sank slowly to one knee in the dirt before a chained, filthy, exhausted kitchen girl, and the sound that rippled through the assembled warriors was not the gasp of shock alone, but something closer to disbelief, bordering on religious awe. "Elora," he said. And the fact that he knew her name at all, a name she had never spoken to him, a name no messenger could have possibly carried the 300 miles between here and his keep in the mere hours since the golden light had first flared, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. "How do you know my name?" she whispered. "I've known your name in 100 different mouths, across 100 different lives," Caelen said, and his voice, for the first time since he'd arrived like a force of nature at the fortress gates, cracked with something achingly human. "I've called you Elora, and I've called you Sarah, and Vasha, and Marin, and a dozen names lost even to my own memory across 400 years of searching. Your soul has worn 100 different faces, and every single time I have felt this." He pressed his hand harder against the mark glowing between them, and gold light bloomed brighter, wrapping around both their joined hands like a living thing. "And every single time, something has torn you away before I could reach you in time." Elora stared down at him, chains still cold at her wrists, and felt something shift and crack open in her chest. Not disbelief exactly, because disbelief would have required her to have some other explanation for the warmth flooding through her, some other reason her scar had never once made sense until this exact moment, kneeling in a mountain courtyard before a stranger who somehow was not a stranger at all. "I don't understand," she said, voice shaking. "I'm no one. I'm an outcast. My own pack traded me away like I was worthless than a hunting dispute. I can't be whatever it is you think I am." "You are the High Queen," Caelen said simply, and the words landed across that courtyard like a struck bell, rippling outward through the stunned crowd of Shadowblade warriors, through Alpha Cain's ashen, horrified face, through Rennick's slack-jawed silence. "You are the other half of a bond older than either of our current lifetimes. My wolf has hunted for your soul across 4 centuries, because without you, it cannot rest, cannot be stable, and every king before me who failed to find his mate in time died raving, half feral, torn apart by a grief his own spirit couldn't survive. You are not less than anyone in this courtyard, Elora. You are the single soul that stands between me and that same fate. You are the reason 400 years of my bloodline has not yet burned itself to ash." Silence, absolute and trembling, filled the courtyard. "Please," he said, quieter now, and it was strange and humbling and almost unbearable to see a man of such overwhelming power reduced to something so raw and pleading. "Please, let me remove these chains. Let me finally, after everything, be the one who reaches you in time." Elora's eyes burned. 18 years of being told she was worthless, of being handed away like a debt, of hiding what she was out of fear and shame, cracked open all at once, and she found she could not speak past the lump in her throat, could only nod. And Caelen rose to his feet with the same fluid-controlled power that had carried him across the entire courtyard, and reached for the chains at her wrists with hands that were, despite everything, remarkably gentle. The iron fell away. Where it had touched her skin, faint golden light lingered for a moment, as though even the metal was reluctant to let go of something so precious. "Alpha Cain," said Caelen, and his voice, when he turned to address the trembling pack leader, had regained every ounce of its royal, unshakable authority. "Your pack held the High Queen of the realm as an unpaid servant for weeks, ignorant of what she was, and I am inclined, given the circumstances, to extend mercy rather than the justice my army is fully capable of delivering. But mercy is not blindness. From this day forward, Shadow Blade Pack will be known across this continent not as the Forgotten Pack, but as the pack that sheltered a queen when she had nowhere else to go. And you will treat that history and every soul within these walls with the honor that history demands. Is that understood?" Cain, pale and trembling with equal parts terror and relief, bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the stone. "Understood, Your Majesty. Completely understood." Caelen turned back to Elora, and for a long moment the fierce, terrifying authority in his face softened into something achingly tender, something that looked almost afraid still, even now, that this might slip away like every version before it had. "I know this is a great deal to accept in a single afternoon," he said softly, just for her. "I am not asking you to love me. I am not asking you to trust me. Not yet. Not after everyone else in your life has given you every reason not to trust anyone at all. I am only asking you to come with me somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere no one will ever again decide your worth without asking you first, and to let me spend however long it takes proving that I am not one more person who will let you down." Elora looked past him, at the fortress that had been cold and cruel to her for weeks, at the pack members who now stared at her with something between awe and shame, at the life she had believed only hours ago would be the only one she'd ever had. And then she looked at the man kneeling, figuratively now, though he had been literal moments before, in front of an entire army, an entire pack, an entire continent's worth of expectation, offering her not command, not ownership, but a choice. No one in 18 years had ever offered her a choice. "Okay," she whispered, and then stronger, "Okay, I'll come with you." The golden light between their joined hands flared bright and warm, and for the first time in 400 years, did not fade. They rode north together. 3 days later, Elora wrapped in a fur-lined cloak too fine for anything she'd ever owned, seated on a horse beside the king's own, and the mountain wind that had once felt so bitterly cold now carried beneath it the faint golden warmth of a bond finally, fully sealing into place. She would learn in the months that followed the full weight and wonder of what she was, not merely a treaty debt or an outcast or a curiosity with an unexplained scar, but the living anchor of an ancient bloodline, the stabilizing soul that would let a king's wolf finally, after 4 centuries, rest. She would learn that Caelen's exhaustion softened week by week as the bond settled, that his amber eyes lost their hunted, restless edge, that his court, wary at first of a queen who'd arrived in chains and kitchen rags, came slowly to love her, not for the crown she now wore, but for the quiet, unshowy kindness she'd carried, even through the worst of her mistreatment. In the first days at the Obsidian Keep, it was Torin, gray-bearded, gruff, a man who had buried 3 cycles of grief alongside his king, who found her wandering the fortress halls, unable to sleep, still unused to a bed so soft it felt like floating, still half-braced for someone to snatch the comfort away. He had not lectured her, had not treated her with the brittle, ceremonial reverence the rest of the court seemed to think she required. He had simply handed her a cup of warm cider, sat with her on the wide stone steps overlooking the moonlit valley, and told her, plainly, that he had watched his king grieve 4 separate versions of her across 4 decades of his own service, and that whatever fear she carried about not being enough, about being unworthy of what she'd been called, was a fear he understood better than anyone alive, and that she had already, in a matter of days, brought more warmth back into that keep than he'd felt in years. It was a small kindness. It was, for a girl who had spent her whole life being unwanted, exactly the kind of kindness that rebuilt a person from the inside out, one quiet gesture at a time. She would return, eventually, to Sunridge, not as an outcast dragged away in a wagon, but as High Queen of the realm, and she would watch Elder Marrow's face go the color of ash as he bowed before the girl he'd traded away without a second thought. She chose mercy there, too, in the end, though she made certain the truth of what had been done to her was never again buried or forgotten. And on quiet nights, in a keep carved from obsidian and moonlight, she would press her palm to the mark on her chest, no longer glowing with warning or grief, but steady, warm, at peace, and feel Caelen's hand cover hers, and understand, fully and finally, what it meant to be found by someone who had never once stopped looking. The forgotten pack, in time, became known across the continent by a different name entirely, the pack that had sheltered a queen, unaware until the whole world lit up gold to tell them who she truly was. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Which scene hit you hardest? See you in the next story.